It was a warm, quiet night in the small town of Bayou Ridge, just outside New Orleans. The crickets sang loudly, and the humid air wrapped around Sarah and Mike as they made their way through the thick, overgrown path leading deep into the swamps. Rumors had been swirling around town about the old, cursed cabin that stood hidden somewhere in the heart of the marshes. They had heard the stories before, but never paid them much attention. Until now. People said no one came back from the cabin. Those who entered were never seen again. It was a story locals loved to tell, especially during Halloween. But Sarah and Mike were tired of the myths and wanted to see the place for themselves. They didn't believe in ghosts or curses and thought it would make a thrilling late-night adventure. They'd dare each other, laugh, and prove the legend was just that, a legend. But as they walked further into the swamp, their confidence began to waver. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the sounds of nature grew quieter. Only the squelching of the mud under their shoes echoed in the dark. Finally, they reached the cabin. It was old, much older than they expected. Its wooden walls were rotting, the roof caved in at parts, and strange, jagged symbols were carved into the door. A thick, rancid smell wafted through the air, making both of them gag. "Ready?" Mike asked, though the question seemed more like a challenge. Sarah hesitated, her gut twisting in a way she couldn't explain. She glanced at Mike, who seemed more determined than ever. "Let's get this over with," she muttered, pushing open the creaky door. Inside, it was worse. The walls were scratched and torn as if something had desperately tried to claw its way out. A thick layer of dust coated the floor, and the air was so thick it felt like it was suffocating them. That smell, it was stronger here, almost unbearable. Suddenly, bang! The door behind them slammed shut with a force that shook the entire cabin. Sarah gasped and spun around. Mike's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. But there was no answer, only the sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps, coming closer. But no one was there. "Mike!" Sarah's voice trembled. "We need to get out of here." Mike didn't respond. He just pointed to a shadow in the corner of the room, creeping towards them. They stared at it, frozen in place. But when they blinked, it was gone. The room suddenly grew icy cold, so cold they could see their breath in the air. Then came the whisper, soft and sinister. "You're not supposed to be here." A sharp pain shot up Sarah's spine as fear gripped her. "We need to leave, now," she said, grabbing Mike's arm. They turned to the door, but the floor beneath them cracked and splintered. Before she could react, the ground gave way beneath Sarah's feet. She screamed as she fell into the darkness below, her fingers clawing at the edges of the broken floor. Cold, bony hands reached up from the abyss, gripping her legs and pulling her down with terrifying force. "Mike, help!" she screamed. But it was too late. The hands yanked her into the darkness, her screams echoing through the cabin. Mike stood there, frozen in place. His breath quickened and his mind raced, but his body refused to move. He couldn't process what he had just seen. One moment, Sarah was beside him, and the next, she was gone. Dragged into the earth by something he couldn't even comprehend. The last thing he heard was her voice, faint and distant, echoing from the hole in the floor. "You're next." Mike's heart pounded as he backed away from the broken floor, his feet stumbling over the uneven boards. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of Sarah. But there was nothing. Just darkness, shadows, and the oppressive silence that filled the cabin. The only sound was his own panicked breathing. Suddenly, a loud thump came from the ceiling, followed by another and another, as if something heavy was walking above him. The wooden beams creaked under the weight, dust falling from the ceiling. Mike's eyes shot upwards, his pulse racing. Whatever it was coming closer. Crash! The ceiling above him burst open, and a rotting wheel figure with hollow eyes fell to the ground, landing just inches from him. Its body was twisted, contorted in unnatural ways, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Mike's stomach turned, bile rising in his throat. The figure twitched, its head snapping towards Mike, eyes wide with hunger. Slowly, it began to crawl towards him, its bony fingers scraping across the floor. Mike stumbled backward, his body shaking, but no matter how fast he moved, the creature was always just behind him. The door. He needed to get to the door. With all the strength he could muster, Mike bolted towards the entrance. His hand reached for the doorknob, but as his fingers wrapped around it, something cold and slimy slid over his wrist. He looked down to see a long, decayed arm snaking its way up from the floor, gripping him tightly. Mike screamed, pulling away with everything he had, but the arm only tightened, its nails digging into his skin. The door rattled, opening just a crack, but the cabin wasn't going to let him leave. Suddenly, a high-pitched laugh echoed through the room, followed by the sound of something slithering along the walls. The arm released him, and he stumbled back, gasping for air. His body trembled, every instinct screaming for him to run. But where? From the corner of the room, the figure began to stand, its bones cracking with every movement. Its head lolled to one side, and its eyes locked onto Mike. The air grew thick with the stench of death as it took a step forward, then another, its bony feet dragging across the floor. Mike's mind raced, searching for an escape. But the room seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing darker, thicker. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Then, from the broken floor where Sarah had fallen, something began to crawl out. More arms, more hands. They reached up, grasping at the edges, pulling themselves out of the darkness. Faces appeared next, faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and black. They crawled slowly, their bodies decayed and broken, but they were coming. All of them were coming. Mike's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, his back pressed against the wall. His eyes darted from the figure in the corner to the crawling horrors emerging from the floor. His breathing became shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls as the creatures surrounded him. The figure in the corner moved closer, its mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. "You're next," the voice whispered again, this time from the figure itself. It reached out a bony hand toward Mike's face, its fingers inches from his skin. Mike closed his eyes, his body shaking with terror. He could feel the cold breath of the figure on his neck, the sound of the crawling creatures closing in on him. Suddenly, the door burst open. The freezing air hit him like a wall, pulling Mike from the nightmare for just a moment. His eyes snapped open and he saw a figure standing in the doorway. For a second, he thought it was Sarah, but it wasn't. This figure was tall, its face hidden in the shadows, its body wrapped in dark, tattered clothing. Without a word, the figure pointed toward Mike, its hand skeletal and unnaturally long. A whisper floated from its lips, so quiet that Mike almost didn't hear it. But the words were clear. "Run." Mike didn't wait. His body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. He scrambled to his feet, his muscles burning as he lunged for the door. The figure stepped aside, and Mike burst through the entrance, running into the night. The swamp was a blur around him. Trees, water, shadows. Nothing made sense anymore. He could still hear the voices, the laughter, the footsteps chasing him through the muck. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Behind him, the cabin loomed in the distance, its dark windows watching him. But the voices were everywhere. They echoed through the trees, whispering his name, telling him to turn around. But Mike didn't listen. He ran until he couldn't anymore, until the whispers faded and the only sound left was the pounding of his own heart. He collapsed at the edge of the swamp, gasping for air, his body trembling. His mind was a haze of terror and confusion. But one thing was clear: he had escaped. Or so he thought. As Mike lay there, his eyes staring up at the starless sky, a cold, familiar voice whispered from the darkness beside him, "You're next." And this time, there was no one left to save him. The nightmare was just beginning. Like and subscribe our channel for more bone-chilling stories.